An archbishop raises his voice and with a few words calls everything into question. The liturgy, the faith, the continuity of the church. This isn't a passing controversy, it's a shock to the very heart of Catholicism. Every Catholic should listen to what he said, because these aren't opinions, but truths that cannot be ignored. In the growing silence of a church that seems to have lost its most authentic voice, Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco has chosen to speak frankly. Not an academic speech, not a curial document, but a public conversation on YouTube with the Argentine priest Javier Oliveira Ravasi, a theologian known for his firm positions in defense of tradition. The meeting had the flavor of a denunciation, and at the same time, an urgent reminder. The liturgy, the beating heart of Catholic life, has lost its sense of continuity. It is not an aesthetic detail or a nostalgic whim. It is, according to Cordileone, the symptom of a deeper crisis affecting the very body of the Church. The American prelate was not afraid to clearly point out the problem. The mentality that has transformed the liturgy into a before and after, as if the history of the Church were divided into two irreconcilable eras, has created visible wounds. The breaking of this line of continuity, explains Cordileone, is one of the main causes of the confusion of the faithful, and especially of the young, who do not find in today's celebration the eternal face of the mystery. This is not a dispute between different aesthetics, but the survival of a faith passed down through generations, a faith that is recognized first and foremost in the cult that gives it shape. When a bishop of the Church forcefully states that a sin is a sin, not because God or the priests have written a list of prohibited acts, but because it goes against the true good of man, he is trying to unmask a mentality that has emptied faith of its most real meaning. With these words, Archbishop Cordileone pointed the finger at a liturgical relativism that has its roots in a much broader problem: the loss of a sense of the sacred. If sin is no longer perceived as a wound to the heart of man, even the liturgy becomes a simple social rite, adaptable to tastes, modifiable according to fashion, easily trivialized. In this context, the Mass has ceased to be perceived as the mystery that bursts upon time to transfigure it, and has transformed in many parishes into a community gathering where language is simplified and gestures lose depth. It's no coincidence that Cordileone forcefully denounces the mentality that reduces ritual to an event, almost as if it were a religious spectacle. From this perspective, the new ordinary risks appearing today as innovation and tomorrow as antiquity, lacking the continuity that binds today's Christians to their forefathers in faith. For the prelate, the problem isn't so much the liturgical reform itself, but rather the way it was received and celebrated. The Second Vatican Council, Cordileone recalls, never called for improvised liturgies with electric guitars or concert-like atmosphere. Indeed, the conciliar documents reaffirmed the centrality of Gregorian chant and the Latin language, calling for the reform to be conducted with discipline and respect for the mystery. Reality, however, tells a different story: fragmentation, improvisation, the idea that the liturgy is malleable matter in the hands of the celebrant, rather than a treasure to be preserved and transmitted. Cordileone used a simple yet disarming expression: if a Mass is new today, tomorrow it will be old. This seemingly banal phrase conceals the most radical criticism of the liturgical reform. A liturgy defined as new is already destined to age because what is founded on novelty inevitably loses its appeal with the passing of time. It is the logic of consumption applied to divine worship. We seek the effect, the immediate impact, and we forget that the Mass was never intended to be fashionable, but to lead man into eternity. For this reason, the prelate of San Francisco observes that today, many young people perceive the so-called Novus Ordo as something dated. The same liturgy that in the 1960s and 1970s was presented as a sign of modernity and renewal now appears worn out, marked by experiments that have not stood the test of time. A young man who crosses the threshold of a parish church and finds himself before an altar transformed into a stage with light music and worldly language feels the weight of a recent past more than the strength of a living present. This is where the paradox emerges. The reform that sought to speak to contemporary man ends up being more obsolete than the tradition it sought to transcend. The classical liturgy, with its sacred language and immutable gestures, is perceived not as ancient, but as eternal. And what is eternal, Cordileone notes, never grows old. This is what young people seek, not a rite designed for their generation, but a celebration that puts them in communion with the saints of all time, capable of transcending fashion and resisting the ravages of history. The phenomenon is also documented by surveys and research. In the United States and Europe, the growth of youth participation in the traditional liturgy is constant, despite the restrictions imposed by the motu proprio traditionis custodes. Where the ancient rite is celebrated, young people flock in large numbers, often with entire families, drawn not by nostalgia, but by a desire for radicality. In a fluid world, they want solid stone. In an age of noise, they seek the silence that speaks of God. The connection with ancestors in faith isn't a matter of spiritual archaeology, but of real life. When a young person enters a church and hears the same prayers that nourished their grandparents, they experience a sense of belonging that transcends words. It is the experience of a living legacy, which touches the soul and transports it into a greater communion. The classical liturgy, with its universal language and its immutable gestures, is not a museum memory. It is the very breath of the Church, which, praying today as it prayed yesterday, makes Christ present in history. According to Cordileone, the loss of this connection has had devastating consequences. Where the liturgy has become a laboratory for experiments, the faithful have ceased to recognize the continuity of their faith. It is as if the Mass no longer speaks to the heart, but changes language depending on the time and place, erasing that invisible bridge that unites Christians of every century. Recovering a sense of continuity is therefore not a luxury for a few traditionalists, but a vital necessity for the entire Church. Cordileone's message sounds like an alarm bell. A liturgy without continuity is lost. Now that Leo XIV is the Supreme Pontiff, the dilemma becomes concrete. A pontiff called to safeguard the faith faces a decisive choice: to embrace the call of tradition with Latin, Gregorian chant, and liturgical discipline, or to give in to the temptation to adapt worship to the fashions of the moment. It is not a question of aesthetics, but of the very heart of the faith. Without solid rites, the Church crumbles. What do you think? If you liked the video, comment Amen. God bless you.